I was at the Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Cascade Heights, which is a predominantly African-American working class neighborhood in Southwest Atlanta, and has one of the highest median energy burdens, which measures the ratio of energy costs relative to income. Electricity bills on average in Cascade eat up nearly 6% of household income, the top 10% of median household income per bill. Atlanta has among the highest median energy burdens, and this is true in cities across the South generally, which are another unaffordable expense that threatens residents' ability to remain in the gentrifying city. And Cascade is on the map, where the church is about on the map here with a blue star. The church was hosting a town hall about the city's 100% clean energy resolution adopted the year prior. Atlanta was the first major city in the South to make such a commitment to procure all electricity from renewable sources by 2035, which applies to all municipal operations, including the city-owned Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, one of the busiest in the world, and all electricity used within city. More than 100 cities and several states across the US adopted similar targets to continue action to reach the Paris Climate Accords during the early years of the Trump administration, when federal efforts to address climate change were repealed. And Atlanta is somewhat unique, given that Georgia as a state has no policy to incent decarbonization. About 40 people slowly trickled into the town hall with advocates from a range of environmental, state, and community organizations outnumbering the neighborhood residents present. But people found their way to the food and piled rice and goat curry onto paper plates and tucked in to listen to a presentation from the Mayor's Office of Resilience. At the conclusion, it was immediately met with questions about what this idea of clean energy and the Mayor's commitment to achieving clean energy through energy efficiency and equity would mean in practice. Juan Smith, a community organizer with the Georgia Conservation Voters, asked for more specifics on the plan, saying, quote, "How would it help provide some relief for the 6th highest energy burden zip codes in Atlanta?" She explained, "I see the word equity, but I didn't see any solutions or any movements that moved towards residents or that were people-oriented." Her questions contributed a healthy skepticism as to whether or how the city could secure the social and economic objectives embedded in its agenda to decarbonize without a clear plan envisioning what equity would look like, or attention to the ways in which racialized disparities in energy burden, housing, and wages are intertwined. A resident followed up asking why city resources were being used for energy planning at all. Because, quote, "You can say we're doing this on Cascade, but you don't gentrify Cascade. Cascade ain't the same community no more." For him, energy was a second-order priority, divorced from the precarity of residents in the neighborhood. Other questions followed about energy efficiency, jobs, the relationship of the city to the public school system, and how the city would educate and disseminate information about any new programs. Electricity was articulated to concerns about employment, housing affordability, poor quality education, and the exorbitant cost of living for renters and those without property. The town hall was a microcosm of a combined optimism and intransigence that have long intersected on Atlanta's electorate. The central question that I am interested in is, why does electricity become a site to exercise demands for social and labor policy? And how effective is the city in achieving these commitments? In what remains of my time today, I will do 3 things. First, I introduce my theoretical framework grounded in urban political ecology. I assert that electricity becomes a site to meet demands for social change because it is fundamentally about control over time in the everyday and over generations. I ask how energy democracy seeks to challenge the subsidy the state provides to electric utilities. Second, I review the historical evolution of the electric utility Georgia Power that serves 2.6 million households in Georgia, including Atlanta. And I argue that Atlanta's 100% clean energy policy falls short because it must contend with the authority of Georgia Power, a vertically integrated investor-owned monopoly that is regulated by the elected Georgia Public Service Commission, which supersedes the authority of the city, and alongside conservative state lawmakers, hobbles the ability of the city to really do anything. I will third conclude in demonstrating 2 strategies employed by the city of Atlanta and organized Atlanta residents to contest Georgia Power and seek representation by politicizing the provision of electricity. My presentation draws on archival and ethnographic research, a few scenes of which are pictured here, in which I asked how energy, and in particular electricity, changes the spaces and tempos of daily life. I draw on 5 years of participant observation at regulatory proceedings before the Public Service Commission, meetings with the predominantly white Sierra Club, and meetings, trainings, and events in predominantly BIPOC organizing spaces with the Partnership for Civil Equity and a utility justice group called We Deploy Co. My position as a white woman and researcher aligned with much of the energy democracy organizing in Atlanta. To embed reparative investment in energy policy informs my analysis of these encounters. To triangulate my research, I conducted 83 semi-structured interviews with solar contractors, city officials, union members, and environmental justice advocates between 2016 and 2022. And I also collected a lot of archival data, which is most of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to go way back in time, including city and state records, newspaper articles, advertisements, and labor. To analyze this material, I draw from scholarship in urban political ecology. To understand how the networks of urban electrical provision and regulation become terrains of political context. Urban political ecology argues that urbanization must be understood as a socio-ecological process of uneven development, meaning that ecological resources such as water, food, clean air, and energy are necessary to the construction of cities and maintenance of city residents, but commodified and distributed unequally under racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is an important term to define as it has a distinct intellectual lineage, building from the work of Cedric Robinson, who argued that capitalism as an economic form in which social relations are mediated through the commodification of labor and access to money, have always been dependent on embodied notions of difference that come to be understood as race during colonialism. Clive Wood's work asks how racial capital is emplaced, organized, and resisted in the US South. And his work is focused specifically on the Mississippi Delta and New Orleans, but is very relevant to thinking about the city of Atlanta as well. Social theorists from diverse disciplinary backgrounds who study nature, gender, and difference argue that within capitalism, certain resources are also unvalued or undervalued. This includes both natural resources and social reproduction, the time spent in maintaining a household, the care work, and emotional and physical work to sustain life in the everyday and over generations. Social reproduction is labor most often formed by women, and also historically and contemporarily has a racialized dimension, as women of color disproportionately work in service and care jobs that are underpaid as unskilled labor. Rosemary Clark-Willard and Jess Dempsey, both geographers in Canada, have written several recent interventions bridging feminist and political ecology scholarship. And importantly, their work investigates the role of the state, both in mediating the exploitation of capital and making resources and workers available to markets, whether through concession agreements for mineral rights, public education and training programs to prepare a workforce, or the enactment or failure to enforce environmental law. In various ways, the state subsidizes and enables processes of accumulation. Bridging these literatures on urban political ecology, racial capitalism, and social reproduction brings into focus the legal and political geographies that shape the energy landscape to enable dispossession and perpetuate uneven growth. My research has asked how the state and utilities organize urban electricity systems under racial capitalism in ways that put demands on our time that are uncompensated and usurp human and non-human energies. I studied this question in the context of environmental injustice, union organizing and union busting, training programs, and rate design. As much as we are customers of the utility, the investor-owned utility model also depends on us to continue to use electricity. As Gargi Bhattacharya observes, our consumption too can become, quote, an activity that serves accumulation. The model of electric utility finance and regulation in Georgia depends on wagering a time of captive custody in the utility's service territory far into the future, and asks us to pay back those costs on monthly utility bills. This effectively collateralizes future demand and weds customers to a vision of growth and a fuel source of the utility's design, which has had significant environmental, climate, embodied, and social costs. The idea that our time is a valuable stock for the utility becomes more apparent with the transition to variable renewable energy, demand response, ideas of a virtual power plant, and time of use rates that all seek to manage electricity used in social reproduction. Even as smart technologies make such actions measurable for those with the resources and property to participate, the question of how they are valued and compensated and whether is only through relationships to property remains. I observe the utility has always weighted these individual and collective decisions. My research builds on that of other scholars who have studied the racialized and gendered dimensions of energy, and grounded in the transformation of urban life that electrification wrought. David Nye is an historian whose work on this is particularly excellent. I asked how electricity combines with a deeply unequal urban built environment in the US, constructed through redlining, urban renewal, and gentrification, that contributes to uneven access and quality housing, as well as living wage employment. The energy future is structured through the state in Georgia, tether capital accumulation to the life-making practices of ratepayers, even as the energy system threatens the survivability of households, whether through disconnection or the accumulation of slow death, that is the result of the accumulation of toxicity in concerns of pollution and environmental injustice. The growing body of energy justice scholarship has brought attention to questions of energy insecurity, ownership, and participation in regulation along lines of gender, race, and geography. This work and that of a long tradition of environmental and energy justice organizers helped to build the case that any public investment in the energy transition should embed principles of justice to correct these inequalities. These demands are embedded in many laws in the state of California, as well as the Justice 40 initiative, that is the Biden administration's commitment to recognition, distributive, procedural, and corrective justice. And this is a diagram that I borrowed from Tony Green's, now Director of Energy Justice at the Department of Energy, who I understand was one of the first speakers in the speaker series, that I think really encapsulates what it means to bring each of these factors around the future of designing the energy system. In my own work with Nick Hyman, I've asked how energy investment can be reparative in confronting a legacy of fiscal policy and repudiating petroracial capitalism in Louisiana. But I also heed the concerns of critical environmental justice scholars, including Laura Polito, Hilda Kurtz, and David Pelham, who caution that environmental justice movements have failed to go far enough to disrupt the ways in which the state permits the slow violence of environmental and energy justice to continue, allowing premature death. This theft of time must be considered as part of the machination of energy within racial capitalism. Their work pushes social scientists not only to recognize disparities, but ask how difference becomes profitable to utilities, and interrogate the political relations that sustain those profit-making mechanisms. For this reason, I argue we must think critically about energy democracy as a prefigurative tool to realize energy justice. Energy democracy is a diffuse and at times conflicting concept that evades clear definition. As Shalonda Baker describes, it is a process that must, quote, center the voices, hopes, and dreams of the poor, people of color, indigenous people, and those marginalized by the old energy system in the design of the new system. Organizing for energy democracy goes beyond a discussion of carbon or jobs in the energy sector to situate the energy system within the state systems of governance and to reframe the intimate uses of energy as a public concern. While different understandings of how to realize energy democracy exist, I understand that at its heart is a radical demand to interrogate the existing formation of state and corporate relationships, to ask how energy can be organized in a way that nurtures and sustains life-affirming relations. So, all that said, I want to take us back to think about the organization of the utility in Atlanta, Georgia. And understanding the contemporary energy landscape of Atlanta requires situating the creation of Georgia Power, that massive investor-owned utility that I introduced at the start of this talk, and the State Public Service Commission that regulates it. And this relationship emerged historically as part of the New South industrialization following the Civil War. The Georgia Electric Light Company, the predecessor of today's Georgia Power, was chartered in 1883. This is less than 20 years after the Civil War ends, when much of Atlanta is destroyed and the city is in the process of rebuilding. They soon won a contract to electrify the city's gas lamps and began to provide lights to wealthy Atlantans, stores, the Opera House, and eventually their charter was expanded to provide mechanical power for industries. In 1889, a rival firm began to consolidate and electrify horse car, dummy engines, and streetcar lines that are pictured on the map here. These had initially been set up by real estate developers who'd established them to move residents to new garden home subdivisions in the north and east of the city under the Atlanta Railway and Power Company. At first, the utilities coexisted. Yet when the Atlanta Railway and Power Company proposed to bid on the contract for the City of Atlanta streetlights, the Georgia Electric and Light Company started a counter-offensive to build duplicative rail infrastructure, filing for permits to put streetcar lines alongside those of their competitor in what the press termed the Second Battle of Atlanta. I don't know if you can see it in the map here, but you see in the very center of the city that there's duplications between the Atlanta Rapid Transit System and the Atlanta Power and Railway Company. So again, Henry Atkinson, then president of the Georgia Electric and Light Company, said that the move was purely speculative. He wrote, quote, in a letter that was quoted in the newspaper, that one has but looked to find unmistakable evidence of the disastrous nature of the competitions of public service industries. They are natural monopolies. No sane man would put money into such competition. It is financial suicide. It means the destruction of property. And this is writing in 1899. The city eventually allowed the competitors to merge in 1902 as the Georgia Railway and Electric Company, but Atkinson's insistence that electricity is best regulated as a natural monopoly is important, because this is a talking point borrowed from the National Electric Light Association, an industry trade group led by Samuel Insull, who's pictured here, who was an important innovator of the big grid model for electricity. At the turn of the 20th century, municipal utilities were growing at twice the rate of investor-owned firms, which struggled to secure market share in a competitive field. Insull determined that private utilities could fend off private and public competition and earn greater profit by voluntarily submitting to regulation. Yet city leaders in Atlanta continued to question if streetlights and streetcars could be more effectively operated by the public as a municipal utility. In the first decade of the 20th century, the future of the city's utilities became embroiled in racial tensions again, and it's very important to situate this in its historical moment. In 1891, a state Jim Crow ordinance to impose racial segregation on streetcars was adopted. It was poorly enforced by companies that did not want to discourage Black ridership in a growing city where a Black middle class was emerging. Atlanta's population skyrocketed between 1880 and 1900, contributing to pressure for jobs, housing, and municipal services, as well as racial resentment. A white supremacist populist movement led by Tom Watson stoked the frenzied anxieties of white working-class residents, urging stricter Jim Crow measures, including on the streetcars, and municipalization of monopoly telegraph, railroad, and electric utilities that were seen as parasites on the working class. Sensationalist newspapers fueled the white populist fervor, leading to a violent racial riot in 1906 that transformed the geography of Atlanta and its electrical system. The riot gained international attention when a white mob destroyed Black businesses and streetcar riders. More than 25 people were killed. In its aftermath, white and Black leaders enacted measures to prevent further violence, including race-based zoning and informal means of segregation. White working-class customers continued to militate for public takeover on the streetcars to more stringently enforce racial segregation laws. And this riot gained international attention for the city. This is an image from a newspaper that was printed in France, and it shows the centrality of the streetcars to this uprising, to this riot. And so instead of the request of companies, instead of municipalizing the streetcars, a compromise measure was adopted to regulate electricity under what was then the State Railroad Commission that would, according to one newspaper, quote, take the street railways entirely out of politics and render them subject to such regulations state may deem proper to place upon. Georgia, along with Wisconsin and New York, were the first to regulate electricity in this way, and Georgia the first to allow popular election of commissioners. The same year, the legislature adopted a law to disenfranchise African American voters. Rather than take the utility out of politics, in his History of Georgia Power, historian Casey Cater insists that the investor-owned utility effectively co-opted, quote, popular demands for the enlargement of white democracy, and promoted regulation as an alternative to public takeover. Empowering the statewide commission to regulate electric utilities cooled but did not eliminate protest, nor did it settle the position of the utility in relation to the city. In 1910, Atlanta granted a franchise to allow a hydropower company to sell power from North Georgia rivers into the city, reintroducing competition into urban electric networks. Shortly thereafter, the hydropower company and Georgia Power's predecessor eventually merged, despite protests from conservationists who warned that the dams would despoil waterways, and development was little more than a financial ploy to issue stocks. In 1918, municipalization was raised when the utility sought to increase rates among fuel shortages during World War I, and the reports of a citizens committee, which argued the rate was a tax on residents, are reported here. This idea echoes W.B. Du Bois, who lamented in Black Reconstruction in America that the overthrow of Reconstruction in the South was accompanied by the privatization of public resources that become, quote, the monopolized basis of private fortunes with perpetual power to tax labor for the right to live and work. After reviewing the case, the Railroad Commission came down firmly in the company's favor, despite the city's utility to restore home rule, arguing that electric interests were far greater than that of the city. They named, quote, they named the utility, quote, a trustee of these great industrial resources. And to this, it should receive at the hands of the public and government agencies fair and unprejudiced treatment. The business interests of this section will suffer if they are not adequately served. The decision moving regulation from the utility, from the city government to the state level was upheld in an appellate court that pronounced it was the duty of the Railroad Commission to set rates in Atlanta and beyond, establishing the utility as a trustee of public well-being. So 3 things are really important to understand the electric utility today. First is the wedding of electricity and growth with a private company as the state-appointed agent for promoting industrial modernization. Electricity was understood as a way to create jobs, foster industry, and improve quality of life with a private utility at the helm. Second was that the decision was based on technical and financial expertise. The Railroad Commission asserted that while the company had put forth many documents establishing why they needed a rate increase, no such technical studies were offered on the part of either the city or on the part of local stakeholders who were opposed to such a rate increase. The effect is that the utility is allowed to write the kinds of regulation that enable it to be to exercise authority in a way that ensures its profitability. And finally, we see that this decision is anti-democratic. While Georgia Power is required to serve all people in its service territory, in shifting the balance of power away from the city, and it introduced a pattern of local preemption, in which the state strips local authorities of the power to regulate at the local level. State regulation locked the city of Atlanta into a position of deference to the utility, and locked Atlanta residents into expensive and inadequate service that failed to serve Black residents of the city in particular. In letters to the company, popular protests, boycotts, and a community-organized jitney service, Black residents sought to bring attention to and address harassment and overcrowding on Georgia Power's limited streetcar lines that served African-American neighborhoods, and also petitioned for electric lighting and electric service to be brought into their neighborhoods. During a rate case in 1927, they brought these concerns before the Railroad Commission, arguing that, quote, Georgia Power was not giving good service to all the citizens of Atlanta. Yet the increase was awarded over their protest in ways that we continue to see throughout the utility's history. Georgia Power's service territory would later be enshrined in state law under the Georgia Territorial Service Act of 1973. Yet the utility's monopoly over the city remains. Further, the state continues to use local production to restrict the powers of local government in other ways. And this is important today when we consider that Atlanta is a majority non-white and democratic city. And it has strived to regulate the conditions of labor and social reproduction in ways that are not necessarily aligned with the Republican state legislature. Notably, preemption has been used to limit the authority of Atlanta to recognize same-sex unions and offer benefits to same-sex partners as city employees. This was before same-sex marriage was decided on by the Supreme Court. It has used it to prohibit the city from increasing minimum wage above the state wage floor, which is still $5.15 an hour, offering fair scheduling, paid leave, or otherwise protecting the value of people's time. Undeterred by these decisions of the Railroad Commission, to take us back to 1918, Mayor James Key proposed that Atlanta could develop public hydropower resources for municipal use in 1918, and sought to purchase power for the Tennessee Valley Authority. Once that option was struck down, he inquired about purchasing TVA power in 1934. While neither of these options were successful, Atlanta remained within the service territory of Georgia Power. Instead, Georgia Power and other southern utilities litigated against the TVA to protect their service territory from incursion by federal power agencies, and then later the Rural Electrification Administration, eventually negotiating to sell wholesale power to co-ops that were eligible for low-cost loans. And this work has been, the history and geography of this is something that Connor Harrison at South Carolina studied really closely. And today the state is a patchwork of public and private power, with the majority of customers in the Georgia Power service territory. So here we see Georgia Power serves everywhere that's in blue, which is very little of the land, but almost all the people in the state. The result is that efforts to democratize access to electricity in the South through public and cooperative power became another tool for the utilities' growth with state support. State regulation has also helped to make Georgia Power profitable, and the Commission operates within a narrow mandate to ensure safe, reliable, and affordable electric service for customers delivered by technically competent and financially viable companies. In recent years, that has included giving the Georgia Power the resources that it needs to run its company, has included a 10.5% return on equity, ensuring, again, a healthy rate of profit. In the post-World War II era, Georgia Power grew exponentially, building 10 new coal-fired power plants and 2 new nuclear plants to provide for increasing demand. Following a model seen nationwide, which historian Richard Hirsch terms the grow and build model, as utilities capitalized on decreasing technology costs to build ever larger power plants, and also incentivized increasing residential use. Here we can see the average annual residential use per customer as it increases over time from the 1800s to the present day. And then that total increase in Georgia Power customers across the state. And much of this growth is happening outside of the actual city of Atlanta. And it's particularly concentrated in the metro area, even if it isn't going to the city itself. And so the graph on the right shows you the change in Atlanta's population relative to the change in the population of the metro. So as Georgia Power actively recruited business to the region and residents moving into new suburban homes, they contributed to a sprawling pattern of urban development that reached out from Atlanta's urban core. There's an amazing archive of advertisements, such as these, that depicted the time-saving potential of electricity in the home, on the farm, and in the workplace. Georgia Power cultivated the demand needed to maintain its profitable grow and build model, not only advertising electricity and appliance sales, but in the process, a new South model of business progressivism, based on low labor costs, low energy costs for industry, and low taxes. A study of new manufacturing plants in the South, produced by the National Planning Association, reported that with few exceptions, quote, electric power alone attracts few industries to a region, but the general locational importance of electric power is best described as improving the industrial environment. Natural resources, access to markets in growing southern cities, ports, rail lines, labor availability, and general attitude of local elites were the reasons cited for plant location, as well as the age, gender, race, and skill level of workers. Yet a subsequent survey of town mayors and Chamber of Commerce officials reported that Georgia Power and the State Department of Industry and Trade were the most important economic development agencies in Georgia, according to James Cobb's history of the growth of the Sun Belt in the second half of the 20th century. Where electricity might not have been a prime reason for relocation, it was an essential feature in an uneven form of Southern industrialization. And Georgia Power continues to retain a central place in the city's economic development and planning. Company executives have chaired the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. The company provides research for Central Atlanta progress. Historian Kevin Cruz describes Georgia Power as an important booster as an old guard member of the business elite. The political scientist Manny Mirabal argues in a scathing critique of the Southern Company, a holding company that owns Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi Power. But these utilities also coordinate a state and regional project that defines modernization in the New South in such a way that, quote, this small but powerful white elite dominates the energy industry, a group of regional capitalists who also hold major investments in the media, transportation, manufacturing, and universities. He argues that the utility forms a ruling class that manipulates popular opinion towards an acceptance of ever-increasing residential electric bills, silences civic and political leaders through corporate bribes and timely financial contributions, and has shared a leadership role in the transformation of the Southern economy from a predominantly agricultural to an industrial base. This growth did not necessarily improve conditions for urban Atlantans. Historian Nancy McLean describes the growth of the Atlanta suburbs as a paradigmatic example of shifting labor relations in the 20th century, based on a model of economic development that treats the majority of residents as, quote, dehumanized instruments for accruing wealth, rather than as subject citizens. To return to Clyde Wood's work, he sees this kind of development that focuses on suburban growth as assets, a growth paradigm based on low labor costs, low tax rates, and low energy costs for business, in practice pulled investment out of Atlanta's urban core, and then low wages, poor to non-existent public benefits, and high energy costs for residents. The racial capitalist lens is necessary to understand the reproduction of racialized inequality. A city which is known as a Black Mecca and is for men, is home to a thriving Black middle class, and yet it also repeatedly ranks as the most unequal city in the United States, where strict race-class segregation is maintained. And so if we return to this map of energy burden, state and private investment help to foster deficient geographies, following a pattern that geographer Willie Wright terms racialized uneven development. On the left, we have the city, and in the center is the class segregation of the city in relation to a 20-county metro area. And on the right, we can see how the metro area is increasingly and continually segregated. Over time, the grow and build model of investor-owned utilities was thrown into a tailspin by the 1970s energy crisis that drove up fuel costs and the utilities' easy access to credit. Georgia Power saw a series of rate increases over 3 years and won opposition from the raft of consumer advocates, first brought by labor leader and founder of the National Domestic Workers Union of America, George Golden, in 1971. The Georgia Power Project formed and revived discussion of a public takeover of utility, but in a way that could represent the interests of all Atlantans, uniting labor and consumer protection groups concerned about skyrocketing utility costs as a tax that takes time from working people, to concerns about the theft of the future, with environmental fears of pollution, nuclear disaster, and eventually climate change. The coalition, some of their statements are depicted here, restarted a conversation that has continued about the failures of the state to represent the needs of Atlanta residents. These concerns were taken on by the city government starting in the 1990s as it began to prepare for the Olympics and started to respond to public upswell and interest in trying to address climate change. The Turner Foundation, led by Ted Turner, who at the time was married to Jane Fonda, took a very activist position on climate change and encouraged Atlanta to use its time in the international spotlight to showcase solar energy and bring solar panel manufacturing to the city as a job creation strategy for empowerment zone residents. Again, this is in the early 1990s. Little came from this early vision, but in 2005, Mayor Shirley Franklin signed the city on to the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, and she later hired city's first sustainability officer. During the Great Recession, when funding flowed to cities across the US from the federal government as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to restart economic activity and incent great job creation, Atlanta charted an expansive plan to address climate change as an issue of racial and economic justice. A former city official described in an interview, quote, "And it came under Obama, and we have Van Jones representing it, and it was the sexy thing to do, right? And Atlanta being a majority minority city and having some labor union presence, there was a desire by different groups to do something on green jobs, to figure it out. But she reports the city just kind of floundered. A structural issue that it continued to face in implementing efforts was its relationship to Georgia Power, which refused to negotiate with the city, and that sustainability issues were poorly understood in relation to other city functions. The CFO might know that the city has to pay its bills to Georgia Power, but paying upfront for energy efficiency or solar that could lead to possible savings down the line didn't fit within the demands of the city budget. Another former official described that the city had a catchy saying, green had to be green. For instance, when the city signed a contract to put solar on municipal buildings, about 7 years ago, to push the, or I guess 5 years ago, to push the limit, it meant that when they signed this contract to put solar on municipal buildings, the first bids on doing so were exempt from the citywide contracting program instituted in the 1970s under Mayor Maynard Jackson administration that required 30% of all municipal work to be certified by small or minority businesses. This is central to growing Black-owned construction firms in the city, and the solar contract was exempted from, and was needed to compete with the utility on a cost competitive standard. Rather than supporting the equitable economy that a Green Jobs program envisioned, the city has had to play the utilities game. Today, the Office of Resilience still depends on foundation money to pilot new initiatives, fund staff, and support strategic planning on their 100% clean energy plan. And since it was adopted, the city has gone through 4 sustainability directors in 4 years, largely due to the fact that people get frustrated. They have a lot of trouble moving anything forward on the plan. But the person who was just hired last month, I think both I and many people who work in Atlanta are really excited about the work that Chandra Farley is going to do. So the story seems depressing. There's actually been positive movement that I'm going to conclude in addressing, which I will focus on as energy democracy in 2 acts. The most important way to take on the utility in Georgia is participate in the integrated resource planning process, which has taken place every 3 years since Georgia's IRP Act was adopted in 1993. While the IRP is meant to increase transparency and participation, much of the process remains shrouded in technical and procedural red tape. Only interveners can cross-examine witnesses, present testimony, and see trade secret filings from the utility. And so here's one example of why it's important to see trade secret filings, as this is a redacted cost estimate for a $9 billion plan that the utility put forward to clean up coal ash. And they're going to pass all of these costs on to customers. In 2022, for the first time ever, Atlanta joined forces with the city of Decatur, Savannah, Athens Clarke County, and DeKalb County to form the Georgia Coalition of Local Governments and intervene in the IRP. These governments represent jurisdictions partially or wholly served by Georgia Power, comprising more than 1.6 million people, 15% of the state population, more than 11 million megawatt hours of community electricity use, including 600,000 megawatt hours for local operations within these municipal governments. The cities asserted their authority to do so, quote, as both large buyers and representatives of their citizens, given their concerns on issues of energy affordability, energy data transparency, and rate design, as well as a desire to transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. Ultimately, the city intervention constitutes an important step to improve energy democracy for Atlanta residents and represent the goals of the city plan in front of the state commission. In July, the city signed on to an agreement reached with the utility to expand a means-tested energy efficiency pilot program that's aimed to support many of the low-income residents who are facing high energy burdens, as well as lower barriers for the city to procure renewables from Georgia Power. The second case in which we can see energy democracy in operation concerns an effort to contest the authority of the state to regulate contest the authority of the State Public Service Commission altogether. Citing the history that I've described here today, in 2020, 4 Black voters who lived in Atlanta sued the state, arguing that African Americans make up more than 30% of Georgia's population, but the at-large method of voting for the statewide Public Service Commission means that the white majority can, quote, defeat the candidates preferred by Black voters. Since 1907, and the lawsuit went through this entire history, only 2 Black people have ever served on the commission, and only 1 was elected, after first being appointed to fill the remaining term of the retiring commission. Their lawsuit challenges the representativeness of the commission, in particular, to represent the needs of the District 3, which encompasses Fulton and DeKalb County, Fulton County being where Atlanta is. And it's part of a wider objection to the narrow mandate of the commission that serves only to support the financial viability of the company in ways that the lawsuit alleges has done so without recognition to residents. The lawsuit was also filed after the State Public Service Commission lifted the moratorium on disconnections due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Georgia Power would go on to turn off more people's lights than any other utility in the country, according to the report compiled by the Center for Biological Diversity. And they argued that this was all made possible because of the non-representation of people of color. And the plaintiffs explained in a press release that, quote, the PSC has voted repeatedly to take actions that hurt the Black community, listing a range of examples, including charging customers in advance for the construction of an ongoing nuclear plant, voting to raise energy rates, increasing mandatory monthly bill fees, establishing residential demand charges, voting to resume shutoffs, and passing COVID-19 costs along to customers. Quote, the burden of all these actions falls most heavily on Black customers and Black voters. The Supreme Court upheld the decision throwing out the method of at-large voting for the State Public Service Commission, which halted an election for District 3 and District 2 that currently were ongoing, District 3 being the one that represents the city of Atlanta. So those will not be on the ballot this year until a new method of voting can be determined that is hopefully more representative of the needs of Atlanta residents. The outcome in this case is important, as it affirms that energy affordability is systemic and steals time from residents who must manage finding live heat, adjusting the temperatures of their homes, possibly to unhealthy settings, manage disconnections, and among other disruptions that the Commission has refused to take into account. So I want to close with this mural of the Georgia Conservation Builders Commission last year as part of a nationwide mobilization around climate, care, jobs, and justice to support the Build Back Better bill. Well, the care element reflected concerns the pandemic. I argue that it also speaks to the concerns about the kinds of labor time that are unrecognized and yet required to keep our economy moving. The example from the South teaches us that models of energy democracy must confront the ways in which the state supports the investor-owned utility at the expense of people, A just transition requires thinking about these diverse uses of time, from workers who may lose their employment, ending the slow violence of environmental justice, and considering the labor of managing utility bills. From the vantage point of imagining how we could use our time differently to build and nourish communities, new pathways of energy justice and energy democracy come into practice.
Great. Thank you so much. We're open for questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. That was very interesting. A lot of great information. I had a question for you that I actually explored in my master's thesis that I'd love to get a new perspective from a political ecologist / geographer. So considering the embeddedness of urban life and energy, I'm curious what role that you think, both political and social, that rural areas will play in the energy transition to supply this commodity without threatening more uneven geographical development, without threatening energy and environmental justice, and then also balancing the benefits and the density of renewable energy resources.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a really great question. And I think it's a really big question. And one that's really been at issue in terms of thinking about the energy transition in Georgia. Georgia is, I think, the 9th state in the country for installed solar capacity, which has largely been required by the State Public Service Commission, although they say it's the free market at work. So there's like kind of an ideological contradiction here. But the question of farmland being converted to solar is a very serious concern in many rural areas that are against what they see as kind of a shift in the agrarian way of life and the prioritization of how land is being used. And that's not something that my research is focused on or that I have an answer to, but it's something that I've also seen in the case of the Tennessee Valley Authority, where rural folks have been very, particularly around some of the coal plant closures, have been amenable to supporting natural gas as a transition that's more legible, or a kind of replacement fuel that they understand to be more reliable. And so that rural-urban dichotomy of how different kinds of energy are valued is very present and really challenging to kind of work across in these spaces. And this is a little bit unrelated, but this has been a really significant issue in the slide that I showed of coal ash. This is regulated in the regulation over coal waste and like cleaning up. The Georgia Power has 29 coal ash ponds at 11 different sites across the state that are really massive. And the question of what to do with that and how to clean it up has largely been taken place through the Department of Environmental Protection, which is a completely separate realm than much of the urban organizing focused on rates and cost, either at the city or at the public service. So you see that these processes are also divorced, which prevents some issues in terms of like kind of the solidarity across urban and rural. So does that get to what you were asking?
Yes, I actually have a follow-up question, if that's okay, just very briefly, but on the same topic. Do you find that there's any areas of political contention related to like energy justice when this comes to mind between the dichotomy of like rural areas and Atlanta?
I think that there's a lot of ways in which people have been trying to bridge that gap, to say like the organizing against the way in which coal ash waste is being handled in rural areas can come into conversation with organizing against the cost of this waste being, the cost of remediation being passed on to customers. So most of the work is like how to build that conversation less than conflict, at least in Georgia. Yeah. Sure.
So, thinking about the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, like racially, who did that act generally serve, and was it done via investor-owned or municipal utilities?
Yeah, so this is something that the Rural Electrification Act was done through, like, people in rural areas could organize to raise capital to get these low cost, to get funding from the federal government to set up electric infrastructure. Because those areas were not being served by investor-owned utilities. And so when that happened, when the act was passed in Georgia, there's a real push by the utility, by Georgia Power, to say, no, we're actually serving those areas. We're doing a fine job. We don't need the federal government to come in. But what you see, I mean, this map shows tons of rural electric co-ops, not that one, this one. There are more than 50 electric co-ops that are called electric membership co-ops that organized across Georgia in places that weren't being served by Georgia Power. And so those are, initially a lot of the wholesale power came from investor-owned utilities, but that has changed over time for different reasons. And then in terms of the other part of your question as to whether they were serving like white agricultural communities or Black agricultural communities, Connor Harrison, who's a geographer at the University of South Carolina, has done some really interesting research on that question. And so I would point you to his work. He's looking specifically at the Rural Electrification Survey in North Carolina, which does show in that context that there's discrimination in terms of the extent, like where electric power lines were actually taken. I haven't spent as much time looking at that in Georgia, just because my work has been focused in that urban context.
Thank you. This is really fantastic. My name is Peter. I'm a first year master's student. When you think about energy democracy and in some cases that means local control, but I think generally that just means like public control, or at least I take it to mean that. Is there a certain size of like that service territory or area in which like no bigger than this or no smaller than that, you know, because I see there's a difference in control and decision making and like ownership of the actual like network, like the lines and the wires and all of that, like the costs that go into that. Like the reason why like utilities ended up buying up each other is because it was cheaper, right, to operate a large infrastructure network to have a monopoly. That's kind of the reason why they exist, right? But you know, for cities, sometimes it makes sense. For other places, it doesn't. What I'm getting at is there's like a point at which, in your opinion or in your research, where like you need to have a multi-city coalition to adequately manage an electricity system to keep rates at a point where it's not too burdensome. Because in a rural area, that could be really expensive. Folks might not be able to afford that. So, do you have a thought on that?
So this is this might seem like sidestepping your question a little bit, but I think I've thought about these questions in most in the context of Georgia, where almost anyone you ask will say, like, Georgia Power is a feature of the landscape, and that's not going to change. And so the question is how to work with the utility and how to work with the State Public Service Commission to try to be more amenable to recognizing the ways in which these really high electric bills are disproportionately affecting some people, and to consider all the other dimensions of jobs in the energy sector, where power gets sited, how they buy it, all these other questions. And so in that context, to work with Georgia Power requires working across the state, which is what the Georgia Coalition of Local Governments is trying to do. And to try to show that it's not just Atlanta, which has always raised a ruckus about this for 100 years, but that there are people, and especially to the question, I didn't catch the name earlier about rural areas, that's been really, really important to try to get commissioners to take action on renewable energy. In 2013, when the commission first said Georgia Power should consider solar energy adoption, that was because of a very strange coalition that came together called the Green Tea Coalition of both the Tea Party and environmentalists, arguing that it was environmentally friendly and fiscally responsible. And numerous commissioners are quoted in saying it was that sort of like conservative and in other cases a rural perspective that really told us this was important. And so in part, I mean, you have the question of, I've been trying to ask the question today of why is the commission willing to disregard what the city wants? But then how can the city seek other allies, and how can organizers working within the city seek other allies to try to push that against the utility?
Can I ask a quick follow-up, or at least repeat a little bit what I heard back, commissioners? So it sounds like in your view, the best path forward for editor, not the best, but more immediate, practical path forward in Georgia for energy democracy, working through the existing like regulatory channels and structures that exist, because Georgia Power is not going on. That's not going to be broken up. That's not going to be segmented down to smaller agencies. But just work with the public, the PSC, to make sure that people are being properly represented, that policies are being implemented, that reflect this. It's not necessarily breaking up the utility, but more managing it in a more democratic way. I
think that's what the work that people have done is focused on, because and I also, this lawsuit has also used and detailed this history to say, how has the Public Service Commission not represented people in Georgia? And how could it be a more stringent way? So it's not always, it's working within these systems, but also questioning them. And there's a ton of other work happening across the South in the Tennessee Valley Authority region. So that's a federal power company, it's a federal power entity. The Tennessee Valley Energy Democracy Movement has worked at different scales because with local power companies, so municipal utilities and rural co-ops, and then also worked to kind of influence the TVA overall. I think those are more organizing questions in terms of how people start to approach what it means to consider trying to democratize their utility.
Thanks for the talk. I really like the way you trace the history of urban energy democracy and justice. And I was wondering if you noticed in your analysis that when energy efficiency retrofits started developing, were there any inequities as to where these retrofits were going initially and where they went? So were they initially targeted towards more disadvantaged communities, or more white neighborhoods where more disadvantaged communities were left out, excluded, because it would then become easier to put them under economic stress, potentially even redlining and acquiring the land for future energy infrastructure? So who was benefiting from these energy efficiency retrofits when they started gaining traction? Of course, now, I think today's times have been targeted towards disadvantaged communities that have been economically, socially, politically deprived. But initially, from the outset, did you notice in your historical analysis that they were either, targeted towards, or let's say there was inequity in where these retrofits were going?
So I have not looked at that question, but I think it's a really good one to consider. And just to keep pointing you to other scholars, there's a really great paper by Anthony Colbert and Marion Warner looking at this question in Buffalo, because a lot of energy efficiency programs proceed through rebates, where you implement an energy saving measure and you get a rebate back, which requires you to put money up front. that people who are struggling to afford their energy bills don't have. And so this is a pretty known problem now. But they do a really great analysis of thinking about tracing where all the rebates went that their utility provided, and how that doesn't match up at all with where energy efficiency, and limited energy efficiency means tested programs like the weatherization assistance program, where that resource was going. So the public resources that are available, and there are some, have been not, they can't address the scale of the problem. And so I think part of what the city of Atlanta asked for with the other coalition of local governments is for the utility to prioritize that more and to move away from this rebate focused program where people with expendable income are the ones benefiting.
I might have missed this in your presentation, but do you have any specific recommendations to improve the political process in terms of democratizing the energy procedure in Atlanta?
That's a really great question. And I don't think the public service question is today, which is for me. But some of the, there were a couple key issues going into, so the integrated resource plan and rate case happen every 3 years. And so people who have been doing a lot of the organizing work to get folks there, to have them represented, had a very serious concern because initially the commission said that they would not allow public comment for concerns about COVID safety. The governor of Georgia lifted most of the COVID prevention measures in May of 2020. So it felt like a real, and the moratorium on eviction, the moratorium on disconnections due to the pandemic was lifted in July of 2020. So it felt like this real double standard where you can say we won't take comment from the public because of pandemic safety, but we won't do anything for pandemic safety and to help folks who were struggling financially either. And so that policy was reversed and public comment has been allowed in the rate case, which is an important aspect of trying to get people's attention and get the commission's attention. So it's, I think, trying to improve people's access to the proceedings, and that's been a big focus of over the summer. Is definitely one pathway, and then there are tons of other elements of what it means for groups to actually participate in the proceedings. And I think this is an area where Georgia is learning a lot from California, where it's like in California, different organizations can get reimbursed for the time that their staff spends in participating in regulatory proceedings. And that's something that we would really love to see in Georgia to ensure that people, small and large environmental justice groups can hire attorneys and participate in this very technical and legal process. So those are just a couple of things. So, there were 2 other questions.
All right, I had one question. In your excellent map of Atlanta showing the areas that were principally Black or low income or something else like that, do you have any documentation or information about the quality of service provided by Georgia Power in those areas? Does it be like outages, time for reconnects and disconnects and so on? Any way to demonstrate that Georgia Power is providing lower quality electrical service in those regions?
I don't, but this is something that I am just starting to work on in part because I've been working for 3 years now with a person who lives in in a neighborhood that has a really high rate of energy burden. And we meet once a week, and their power has gone out probably once a month on those calls. And that is not something, so this is totally anecdotal. This is how I got interested in that question, because Georgia Power, it says that like power goes out kind of, in their service territory in the order of hours over the course of a year. But just anecdotally, in my relationship with this person, their power goes out all the time, and they see it as just kind of normal. But so that's something I'm looking into, but don't have an answer for you yet. So maybe in 6 months.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this was a really interesting presentation, and I've been curious about how grids developed and how we got to this system for a while and haven't really had time to look into it. And so this is super fascinating. One question I had, and I think you touched on this, but the way that the really technical nature of decision-making processes about the grid and kind of the concentration of who's generating that research is a sort of disempowering and a barrier to public participation. And I was just curious what you think could be done to generally empower people to understand how the grid is operated more and be able to advocate for themselves in those spaces, or if there's anything in the public meetings you've observed with how they present information to people that you think is either good or bad.
So there's a couple different initiatives that have taken place in Atlanta, organized by different, with different audiences in mind, that really take on this question of trying to do like a group study about how to even get ready to approach the IRP. Because it is really technical and people don't have a lot of resources. And so there's an environmental organization that was the entity that first proposed Atlanta using, working with the Turner Foundation to implement solar manufacturing in the city in the 90s, called South Base. Runs a workshop series that's open to anybody who wants to attend, and they've done this in advance of the 2019 IRP and the 2022 IRP. So they helped to work with the city on doing its outreach plan for its 100% clean energy initiative, and just realized that there wasn't like people. The city plan was going to rely heavily on renewable energy credits, which everyone was opposed to. But there wasn't really another way for the city to procure its energy. And so they started doing these educational workshops to let people know. And then there's a ton of different initiatives that have followed from that are very heavily on Instagram, that like student groups have organized, community groups have organized. We Have a Plug Though is one example of one. Of just saying like, what is the IRP? How do we understand what's happening within it? What are some of the major issues? Why is the Georgia Power talking so much about the reserve margin? So that kind of community, like working together, has definitely been the primary.
Yeah, so going back to the whole investor buildings, so the Security Exchange Commission has done these reports and found that, surprise, Black people are completely underrepresented in the stock market, with the main constraint being income. Has there been any attempt to quantify the wealth transfer just on energy alone that's occurred through, these investor-owned utilities and stocks, and then there could be a whole discussion on should we be using venture capital to fund these energy investments, or what comes along with that?
That's a really great question. And again, I don't know of an example where that's been done. But I think would be really, Georgia Power reports, so all of the graphs of the energy use over time come from Georgia Power's annual reports, some of which you have to go to the city archives to access, but they report how much money they earned, how much that was returned in stock. I don't know if you could figure out where their stockholders are, that demographic breakdown, but the idea that they need to have a particular rate of return to be able to continue to get access to capital is sort of a driving idea at the commission. In advance of this huge rate increase that they got in 2019, one of the commissioners explained that he had just been in New York City on Wall Street and understood how important it was for them to get this rate increase to continue to have access to capital. And that like they pay a really good dividend. So those are the interesting questions to me.
I was flabbergasted by the multi-billion-dollar bill coming up for ash, the fly ash disposal. And I guess then there's the other one about who's going to pay for the Oglethorpe nuclear power plant. They're about, sounds like they're both about the same size. In terms of deciding capital transfer and wealth transfer, who's going to decide how that's going to be covered by the consumers or the state?
So this is, I think, a really interesting question, back to your question about how do people even get involved in this process, of where you see multiple branches of government reinforcing the utility. So for those who might not know, Georgia Power is currently, the Southern Company is building a nuclear plant on the Savannah River. It's the only one under construction currently in the US. It's really over budget, $30 billion. And that's current, so the traditional model of how utilities would build plants is that they would build it and then have cost recovery. And the state legislature has allowed a construction work in progress charge. So people are already paying for the power plant. It's like $100 a year per person. So that was enabled through a law passed by the legislature to help to like incentivize the nuclear energy industry in Georgia. And the questions of coal ash recovery cleanup have been challenged by the Sierra Club in saying that there's documentation going back to the 70s when these coal plants first opened. The Georgia Power decided not to put the protective liner in place under the coal slurry impoundments because it was going to cost more money. But it was something, it was in the order of millions. And so they knew that leakage of the coal ash waste into groundwater was possible, but as a cost-saving measure at that time, didn't do it. And so the Sierra Club has tried to use, again, using this history as evidence to say we shouldn't have to pay for those costs now as ratepayers. And just, I think that decision, there was a decision that went, the Public Service Commission said, no, those costs can be recovered. And the Sierra Club sued, taking that to court. And the court affirmed that those costs could be recovered. So in that sense, you also see the judiciary branch like supporting Georgia Power. And an important aspect of that is that like this is their report of what it's going to cost. And so there's very little oversight in terms of what that $9 billion is going towards, and they're not planning to excavate all of the ash ponds. Georgia Power got like a special exemption from the EPA to regulate coal ash within the state under the Trump administration. So the EPD of Georgia regulates coal ash. And despite the Biden administration revisiting the environmental, like the EPA's regulations around coal ash, it looks like the EPD, like the existing plan will be.
Great, well, thanks guys, thanks for so much of your time and all the great questions.